Why is street photography important?
Why is it important? Well, again, because the one of the most elemental human conditions, forms of the human condition there is everyday life in the street. There's not any place in the world where people live, certain nomadic tribes maybe in the Sahara Desert or places you'd say, well, there's really no street there. But still, there is a kind of everyday public life out in amidst whatever community, nation, you may be one of millions and millions of Russians, or you may be one of a few Tuareg in some particular situation. So it is one of the most pervasive situations in life. And these situations in which ordinary people who are not doing extraordinary things nevertheless present themselves to the world, whatever world they're living in. And so street photography is clearly elemental to what photography can do and what it must do. It's one of the closest things that's possible to a universal subject matter and a universal aesthetic that comes out of it, that photography can do, at least where human beings are the subject. Landscape is its own genre, usually without people. That's a different thing. Studio portraiture, again, I'm not saying that other genres are somehow marginalized, but street photography has the largest scope in a sense. And even Irving Penn, as I say, all kinds of photographers who wound up doing something very different often cut their teeth and learned some very elemental things about photography by doing street photographs, even if they were in their own mind doing them only for their own edification, not for publication or to attract attention or get a show.
How did these photographers during the the 60s and the 70s that you've mentioned before sort of change the conversation in terms of what street photography could be and was?
The 60s presented the first time in America since the Depression where lots of people were coming together in the street for political reasons. So there was, if you lived in New York in the 60s, as I did, I first moved to New York in 1964, and I remained there until 84. And life in New York, life on the street is always exciting and interesting in certain ways, but there was also, again, a newsworthy aspect to it and a kind of purpose in the demonstrations and in the general sort of presence that an anti-war sentiment began to develop at that time. So it was a situation in a certain sense without having the governmental organizations sponsoring it that did in the 30s. But in the 30s there was a crisis in American society brought on by economic conditions that gave public life a kind of newsworthiness even when it was just everyday life. And the same was true in the 60s in New York. People gathered in parks, it wasn't just mass meetings and demonstrations and things like that, but there was a kind of, between the hippies, first we had the hippies, then we had the yippies who were, there were people who were manifesting in the street, and there were ordinary people who were in the street and felt more relaxed and had a different lifestyle, a different way of presenting themselves there. And someone with a camera in his hand who had a very subtle sense of image. I mean, Joel, for instance, he would go out at night when dog walkers went to the park and got some amazing pictures of just people out walking their dogs before they and the dogs went home and went to bed, stuff like that. So there was an aspect of public life in the street, not just everyday life, but public life in the street, that between the show-offiness of 60s clothing and the hippies and things like that, and the concentrated concern of people who were in the anti-war movement made being on the streets really exciting, and you could never tell when something would happen that was out of the ordinary, and you could just cruise the streets all day long if you had the time and something was sustaining you financially to do it. You could just cruise the streets all day long and you would find remarkable things to be seen, because it was a remarkable time. And in some ways, because there was a crisis in the air.
Yeah.
Political, not economic, as in the 30s. Very different time, but still. That's what put new juice into street photography.
Let's talk about the aesthetics of the frame. As much as the theater of the streets and those disparate elements coming together in that frame are so important, but it seems that just as important as with any other type of photography, considerations of lighting, contrast, color, all of those things coming into play. When you're taking a look at street photography that really resonates with you, how key is that to everything else that we've been talking about towards the success of a really great street photograph?
It is key because one of the things that Joel and I talk about a lot is the incidental detail. Cartier-Bresson has talked a lot about when he discovered the Leica camera, that did it for him because he has this thing about the golden mean, the perfect frame for a picture, a painting, any, whatever. And the 35 millimeter frame in a Leica camera held that for him. And it held it, you know, this is all changing now as we get away from film and into a lot more photographic technological possibilities with new cameras and different formats. But at any rate, the point is that the Leica had a certain frame that could be horizontal or vertical, was usually horizontal in street photography, and it allowed you at a certain range from a certain kind of subject, an incident that was happening, or a collision of two visual things that weren't aware of each other, but you were aware as the photographer. But it also allowed for all kinds of stuff to be sort of salted around them. And sometimes those things that were salted around them were really crucial to the success of the picture, to the coherence of the picture, even though it seemed to be an incidental, and at the time, even to the photographer, it may have seemed like an irrelevant detail, and yet it was a little linchpin that kind of made the whole picture work. Not just what happened in the middle, but what was in the whole thing. You had to see the whole frame. And again, like a good athlete who, playing in a basketball game can see what everybody on the court is doing when he's trying to set up his shot. So a street photographer sees the guy who's guarding him or the guy who's the subject that he's got to focus on, but he's got great peripheral vision. So the frame is really important in street photography as much as or even more than in any other genre of photography. And that aspect of it is, again, what makes it a unique genre and an artistic form. And that, like paintings, like almost any other art form, it's made within the confines of a certain discipline that has to do with what a painter puts on his easel and what a photographer puts in, the camera he chooses with which to make his images.
Have you found that the advent of digital and the whole technological advancements that have happened in photography, have you seen anything that has impacted street photography as a result of those transformations and evolutions?
Well, one of the things, and this is something that Joel realized, as you're aware, we're doing this new edition of Bystander. It's going to have a new 5th section with new text by me and a new conversation between me and Joel and a bunch of new street photography made since 2001. And one of the things that Joel has come to realize, as he himself has been scanning the internet looking for photographers, people doing street photography, really trying to get a full sense of what's going on out there, and then been getting to know a lot of other photographers, he, having started with the Leica back in the 60s in the film era, when he got his first digital Leica, he always, when he would go out and shoot, would be careful to save everything before he edited. What he's discovered is that many younger photographers go out and spend a day shooting and then pick the pictures when they get home, back to the studio or whatever, that they think are significant and erase the rest. And he's been going around making a real mission out of saying to younger photographers, don't do that. Because some of the most important pictures I've taken, it was only a year later that something I took made me realize there was a picture I'd done a year ago that I hadn't paid any attention to that was important. And I hadn't been able to see its importance yet. And the ability to go back and look at those contact sheets again is absolutely crucial. There is a certain back and forth in time that happens to any photographer. Yeah. And if you take advantage of the compactness, the evanescence of digital storage of photographs, by just flushing stuff out of the camera and not, setting up a storage system that allows you to keep those files and keep them at a fairly decent density so that you can go back to pictures and still use them because it took you 6 months or a year, maybe several years to think, oh, wait a minute, I've done pictures like this before. I didn't see the significance of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I don't know if that's something that's sort of unique to the practice of street photography, but it's this idea that somehow unconsciously you can make a photograph that is very effective, but at the moment that you first see it, you don't recognize it. And then later on, as you further develop your awareness of what a good photograph is, as you expand your vocabulary, you revisit those images and you realize what you achieved, probably unconsciously to some extent, but makes that photograph extraordinary. Do you think that that's something that's unique to street photography?
No, I don't think it's unique to street photography because I know from, I mentioned Irving Penn before, I know from having had many conversations with Irving that when he would shoot maybe a dozen different, Irving had a period when he would literally drive people into a corner. He would take two theatrical flats and push them together so that people had to figure out how to respond to the space. And he would shoot a dozen portraits like that. And sometimes it was only later that one of them stood out from the one he'd selected at the time that he would go back to. So it's a process that's inherent in photography and photography's ability, if you're shooting landscapes, if you're shooting portraits in a studio, no matter where you're shooting, to make multiple exposures and then need to hang on to that because the one you choose at that moment, there may be one other that you ignored or didn't even think was worth saving, but you thought, oh, well, I'll keep it too. But in street photography, this is really crucial because to the extent that you're depending on the timing of your eye and you're trusting your instincts and you can't fully be conscious of and analyzing everything that's going on in that frame. This is uniquely true of street photography, although it's also true of war photography and other situations where people are photographing under different, not everyday circumstances. And so the ability to hang on to things and to trust that you may have had almost a subconscious response to something in that frame that made you take that picture. And then the first time when you went and looked at it on the contact sheet or in the file in your digital camera or in your storage facility for digital pictures, you still didn't become conscious of what the trigger might have been or what was unique, what was original in that particular picture. You may have responded to the things that looked like other pictures you'd taken before, and only later in going back do you realize there's something new going on there too, that you can incorporate and play to and maybe make more central to your photography. So street photography is the most crucial example of that. But again, in also photojournalism in a larger sense. But because photojournalism is shot to be right now and get published and then you pass on and don't go back, street photography, where photographers always have this kind of longevity because the basic conditions, the social milieu, the way people dress, many things may change on the street. But what you're looking at is the long view of everyday life. And so the ability to save all of that and to be able to have a dialogue with yourself that moves back and forth in time is most crucial perhaps in this genre.
Would it suffice it to say that the book Bystander was basically your self-education?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And it came out of being on the street with Joel. It came out of the conversations Joel and I had, which is why we ended the book with a conversation and why we're going to end the new book with a conversation. Just like the conversation I'm having with you. I mean, this is, as I'm talking to you, I'm phrasing and indeed thinking of things like details in ways that I've never written down before, but may at some point. This is what stimulated me. Because when I started, unlike the doctoral degree I did, for instance, where it was reading and the formal structure of a classroom that educated me there. Street photography, like the street photographer himself, I had to pick up my knowledge of this genre as I went along because I had no background in it. I'd never studied photo history. As I said, I'd never had an art history course in my life. And so, it came out of part of the unity of it as an experience was that, like the photographs, whatever insights I was capable of having or might have been capable of having into street photography came out of spontaneous everyday experiences, just like the photographs. Joel and I going and looking at stuff and talking about it. We used to go down to the Museum of Modern Art. If he had an afternoon off and I wasn't teaching when we were first interested in this, we'd walk down to the Modern if it was a nice day. And we could just drop in, and John Jarkowski would say, oh, well, excuse me. John Jarkowski would say, well, what do you want to look at today? Well, let's have a box of Atget. Could we look at some of one of Winogrand's really early works? Whatever, whatever.
That's an e-ticket ride.
Right. It wasn't, the offices of the Department of Photography were then in a brownstone that the museum had bought with the idea of eventually building the museum tower, but they'd broken through the wall from the original museum, and the offices were in this rather cramped space. It was very informal. And there were lots of opportunities for pretty spontaneous experiences of studying this stuff as well as still of doing it in the street. Because, it wasn't, we called attention to it as an organized thing, but it wasn't organized for us. We were kind of figuring it out as we went along, both the photography and how to talk about it and then how to write about it and publish it in this as a history.
How have the outlets for street photography changed over the last 50 years?
Well, over the last 50, 60 years, they've changed most radically over the last 2 decades. Because, for reasons that are complex, and we can get into this if you want, but because of the impact of the change, it has to do with the academicization of the study of photography. It's being incorporated into art history curricula in a way it had never been before. It has to do with the whole public discourse about photography becoming highly formalized and very theoretical in the postmodernist era. And that era and the success, the impact that it had, has displaced a number of traditional genres, but street photography most especially. Street photography today, in the 60s, 70s, up through the 80s until the 90s, it lived both in its contemporary life and its historical life in museum exhibitions and in galleries and so forth and so on. But since the 90s, it's been harder and harder for a young street photographer to get a gallery to represent him, to have really a hope of making much of a living out of street photography per se. So most of it now lives online. There are vast amounts of it to be seen. There are sort of organizations that have been set up online, like the group called In Public in England, that are, where these guys gather in the way that people gathered in Winogrand's apartment, decades ago, and in other public forums to show each other work and so forth and so on. And there's great work out there, but there's not the kind of, it's been the history of photography and the central place that street photography is occupied in it has been decentered and remains still decentered today, even though postmodernism is kind of passé now. The impact that postmodernist aesthetics and postmodernist theory and postmodernist art had on the history of photography has created that decentering in a certain way. Before Stieglitz, photographers had been trying to get their work accepted as an art form. And the way they did this was to differentiate themselves from the sort of vulgar and debased mass medium that photography became even before it could be reproduced in newspapers and things like that. It was often the basis. Photographs were the basis for drawings that were put in newspapers. So the aesthetics of photography were beginning to infiltrate photography as a mass medium, even before photographs could be reproduced. And then by Ries's time, you could begin to crudely reproduce them. And distancing themselves from the tabloid press, from advertising, from all those kinds of uses of photography was the main strategy of art photographers from Stieglitz and even before Stieglitz on. And then a group of people, artists, young artists, came along who had not necessarily been trained as photographers or had been inherently interested in photography as their medium, came along and following the crucial lead, and really the crucial figure here, of Andy Warhol, they embraced photography because it's a vulgar and debased mass medium, rather than trying to separate themselves from it, and immediately got into all the hot contemporary galleries and started getting the prices that painting and printmaking were getting. And photography became, in many ways, the essential subject of discussion in the art world, beginning in the 80s and gaining momentum through the 90s and up to the present day. But it's a discussion of photography which has displaced traditional street photography and displaced traditional street photographers, with some exceptions. I'm not saying that there's, it's everybody's forgotten street photography in its original form. Not at all. But nevertheless, in the contemporary art scene, still it remains something that's been part of the history of photography that's been displaced by postmodernism.
Have books over the last 15, 20 years played an increasing role in the distribution of street photography?
Books?
Yeah.
Yes, certainly they have. The current possibilities of on-demand book printing have made books, the creation of books, possible in a way. Books that are actually being created by artists and by independent curators without a big press to do that have made an important contribution. Even though the distribution might be quite limited at first for those books, the fact that they historically exist and will continue, there are hard copies and online copies of a lot of that kind of material, mean that a lot of that history is now preserved and may be seen to be more important as time goes on. And outside of that, photographers, as I say, as a community, have been living online and exchanging images online in a way that had not been possible, in creating dialogues and real discussion groups that are international and spontaneous as photography itself, due to the internet. So it's not that like all bad, and photography's been ruined by this. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts and what excites you about this joint effort between Acuity Press and PDN in the production of this book, Street Photography 2015?
Well, part of what excites me is that it can exploit precisely the possibilities that I've just been talking about. Because it's going to, through PDN, it's going to reach a very wide range of photographers who might be able to contribute work to the website and to the, I don't know whether we're talking about it as a contest or a forum or exactly how it's being pitched now, but it's really an open call of a kind that's going to allow photographers to show work and to be in touch, be familiar with each other's work using the internet as their forum. It formalizes something that's been happening more informally among lots of photographers for quite a while in a way that's really good, that's in a sense not essentially competitive, but is rather, it's an omnivore. It's going to be a kind of omnivore for photography of this sort. And Acuity Press, the way it's being set up, is also going to be an economically feasible, as I understand the parameters that are being used, it's going to be an economically feasible way to keep that formal relationship between a book as a hard object and a book as something online and a larger context, to get those things to cooperate and work with each other to preserve the historical record.